There are moments in life when something becomes intolerable. Not uncomfortable, not irritating, not inconvenient, intolerable. And once that line is crossed, whether quietly or all at once, you're no longer deciding between comfort and discomfort. You're deciding between three fundamentally different relationships with reality. You can try to change the situation, you can stay and tolerate it, or you can leave. Most people think they cycle through these options in a logical order, as if maturity means exhausting one before moving on to the next. In reality, we drift between them emotionally long before we ever act. We tolerate long before we admit it. We fantasize about leaving long before we plan. And we attempt to change things long after it's rational to do so. What matters is not that you choose one of these responses, but that you understand what each one of them actually costs you. Change is always the first posture people celebrate, and for good reason. It feels active, it feels brave, it feels morally clean. We like the idea that if something is wrong, we stand up, we confront it, we fix it, and the story resolves. But beneath the narrative, change is not heroic. Change is mechanical. Change is the slow friction between what is and what you are repeatedly willing to do about it. The thing that almost nobody admits out loud is that the only part of any system you directly control is yourself. You can argue with other people, you can plead, you can persuade, you can threaten, but the only lever that is ever truly in your hand is how you think, how you respond, how consistently you're willing to act in alignment with your own claims. That is not a motivational slogan. It is a constraint of reality. When people say they cannot change a situation, what they often mean is that they cannot change other people. And that may be true. But it is not the same thing as not being able to change the situation at all, because systems respond to pressure, dynamics respond to consistency, roles respond to refusal as much as they do to argument. And sometimes the most destabilizing thing you can do to a dysfunctional structure is not to attack it, but to stop playing your assigned part inside it. Even your preferences sit inside this mechanism, much more than we like to admit. We talk about what we like and dislike as if they're fixed traits, as if irritation and attraction are dictated entirely by the external world. But over time, attention trains the nervous system. You can slowly and imperfectly reduce the emotional tax of something by starving it of meaning. This does not make you passive. It makes you selective about where your energy is allowed to land. Still, change is expensive. It consumes emotional fuel. It creates conflict. It destabilizes social equilibrium. And often it fails. Not always because the attempt was wrong, but because other people are remarkably skilled at protecting their own self-image. We cling to our stories about ourselves far more tightly than we cling to the truth. And the more a belief is entangled with identity, the more evidence it can survive without collapsing. Sometimes what drives the impulse to change isn't irritation, but injustice. Sometimes what you're responding to is not your own discomfort, but the harm being done to someone else in front of you. In those moments, change stops being a personal preference and starts to feel like a moral obligation. You can try to expose consequences instead of assigning blame. You can try to make the cost visible instead of making the person the target. But even that often sounds like accusation. Not because the point is false, but because being shown the damage of your actions rarely feels neutral. This is why successful change is rare, and why, when it does happen, even incrementally, it deserves to be taken seriously as an achievement. Change is not just effort. It is sustained effort under resistance, and most people underestimate how heavy that really is. Tolerance sits in a very different psychological space. We often talk about it as weakness, as resignation, as passivity. But that is a shallow reading of what tolerance actually is. In many cases, tolerance is simply the decision to remain in contact with the situation without trying to dominate it. It is the refusal to let every discomfort escalate into a battle, and sometimes tolerance is not a surrender at all. Sometimes it's reconnaissance. Sometimes it's waiting for the conditions that make real movement possible. Timing is not a trivial variable. There are moments where any attempt to change something will only strengthen the structure you're pushing against. There are moments where leaving immediately would place you in greater danger than staying. And in those moments, tolerance is not approval, it is strategy. The danger with tolerance is not that it exists. The danger is when it becomes invisible to the person practicing it. When endurance is no longer something you are choosing, but something you're performing automatically. When compromise erodes into identity erosion. When the story shifts from I am waiting to this is just how it is, tolerance costs you something too. It costs you time. It costs you emotional bandwidth. And in some cases, it slowly normalizes conditions that should never have become normal at all. The line between patience and self-abandonment is not fixed. It moves depending on what you are tolerating and what it is doing to you. Leaving is the option most moral systems treat with suspicion. It is coded as selfish, disloyal, weak. We romanticize endurance and demonize exit. But there is a truth that cuts through all moral theatre. If you're actively being harmed, leaving is not the last resort. It is the first one. Survival is not a philosophical stance. It is a biological one. However, that does not mean leaving must be impulsive. Escaping danger is not the same thing as leaping blindly. The highest risk moment in many harmful situations is not staying. It is leaving without preparation. This is where fantasy and reality part company. In imagination, exit is clean. In real systems, exit often triggers retaliation, instability, or sudden vulnerability. A rational exit is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is planned. It is boring. It includes safety, resources, witnesses, where necessary, and timing that does not flatter the ego but protects the body and the future. Leaving safely is not cowardice. It is competence under threat. The real mistake people make is not choosing the wrong option. It is mistaking one option for another. They believe they are changing when they are only expressing dissatisfaction. They believe they are tolerating strategically when they are actually frozen. They believe they have left because they have taken physical distance while remaining psychologically captive to what they escaped. These three responses are not stages of maturity. They are tools. And tools are only moral or immoral in relation to the work they are being used to do. The deeper skill is not committing yourself permanently to change or tolerance or exit. The deeper skill is learning to recognize the season you're actually living in. There are seasons where change is possible and avoidance is just fear. There are seasons where tolerance is wise and confrontation would be reckless. And there are seasons where remaining where you are is not strength at all, but slow self-destruction. What makes this difficult is that each of these options will punish you in a different way. Change will exhaust you and fail publicly. Tolerance will dull you quietly. Leaving will isolate you and break narratives you once relied on. There's no pain-free path here. There's only the question of which pain is actually aligned with your survival and your integrity. Most people drift into their answers without ever realizing they're making a choice. They wake up years later inside a posture they no longer remember adopting. Agency does not always disappear in a single moment. Sometimes it erodes slowly under the weight of the unexamined endurance. If there is a single unifying truth beneath all of this, it is that responsibility does not mean forcing outcomes. It means choosing your relationship to what you cannot fully control with your eyes open. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say is not, "This will change," or "I can live with that," but "I'm leaving, and I will do so in a way that keeps me alive long enough to become someone else."